Hello and welcome to the latest in a regular series of webinars from Real Story Group. My name is Tony Byrne. I'm the founder of Real Story Group and really delighted to join you today for really a favorite topic of mine, how to select the right CDP technology. It kind of marries two different themes we've been on really since the beginning of Real Story Group. One is the right way to select technology, and especially marketing technology. And then, what's been going on with respect to customer data, where we've seen a lot of evolution over the last 10 years. And of course, a lot of enthusiasm. It ebbs and flows, but still a lot of enthusiasm around CDP technology. So we'll get into it here real quick. Just wanted to let you know that everyone will receive a copy of this deck in the next 48 hours or so. And if you are a Real Story Group subscriber, you'll also have access to a video recording of this webinar that will show up automatically in your library when you log in. If you have any questions at all or any comments, anything you agree with, you want to disagree with, something you think is missing, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll definitely have time at the end to handle that. So without further ado, let's get into it. First, we know a lot of you are on the line here today are new to Real Story Group. We're an analyst firm, but we're a different type of analyst firm. We're quite different from the Gartner and Forresters of this world, always have been, in as much as we only sit on your side of the table. That is, we only focus on buyers of technology. Turns out this is kind of a unique value proposition in our industry. We never advise vendors, we never speak at their events, we don't accept a cup of coffee for them, we don't write white papers for them. And so that allows us to tell you the real story around how these tools work, and more importantly, how they don't work. So I think we're known as the toughest critics in the analyst world, and I think you'll find out why here in just a minute. So we are covering today not personalization platforms, but customer data platforms. That's the orange line on this MarTech stack vendor map. So this is where we show all of the different vendors that Real Story Group evaluates in our hard-hitting vendor evaluations. And we decided one way to organize the 160 or so vendors was to do this kind of would-be subway or tube map. The orange line are CDP vendors. Like every other line, it goes through the city center where you see Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, Salesforce, and others. So that means that there are big players, but as you can imagine, a lot of the innovation and interesting stuff is happening out in the periphery as well. So we'll have a few things to say about that a little bit later. But another way of putting this is that the CDP market, like every other MarTech marketplace, is highly fragmented. So fragmented is kind of analyst speak for there's a hell of a lot of vendors for you to choose from, and so it gets very confusing, certainly for our subscribers, and we want to give you a process where you can take out some of that confusion. So real quickly in this half hour, we're going to talk about the evolution of CDPs, current trends, and future outlook, and then spend the majority of our time talking about what's the right way to select CDPs before we wrap up with some key takeaways. Let's start with the evolution of CDPs. Really, in the 2010, 2013 era, we were really talking about marketing databases. For many of you, those databases sort of moved into your email marketing platforms, and those became a database of record. For many of you, it's still there. That's a bad place for you to have your marketing and customer data of record for a variety of different reasons. In fact, any engagement channel is the wrong place for you to have your data. That's why CDPs emerged as this kind of channel neutral alternative where you could have ready access to the right customer data in a channel neutral way. Got a boost, of course, from GDPR and other privacy, we saw some industry maturation, and now we're seeing really the rise of what we would describe as modern CDPs with some degree of composability, some degree of AI-driven insights, and depending on the vendor, increasingly more real-time interactivity, which is, as we'll see, increasingly important. So what CDPs were part of a broader kind of organic trend where, we had this silo problem coming out of the 2010s where we had all of this content, data, rules, planning, and analytics kind of jammed into each one of your customer engagement platforms. And you still see that very often today. For example, an outbound marketing or a web content management system or an e-commerce platform that has its own content, has its own data, has its own rules, has its own planning, has its own analytics. And consequently, it's very difficult for you to manage anything multi-channel, let alone omni-channel. And so that's the problem on your side. The problem on the other side of the screen is that your customers, of course, have very disjointed experiences. So the rise of customer data platforms was the first of what we would describe as more legless architectures, where you were decoupling a certain capability. In this case, it was data management from the engagement platform and managing it separately. So this was a shift, that kind of many of you may have heard of headless, where you decouple the presentation from the engagement. In 2020s, we're seeing a transition more to legless, where you decouple content and especially data from engagement environments. And CDPs were really sort of the harbinger of that particular trend. So in a traditional CDP model, the idea here is that you have a variety of customer data that's from a variety of different sources on the left. It goes into some sort of central place where there's a variety of different services that are applied to it, like identity resolution, maybe some data cleaning, ETL, certainly enrichment, segmentation, activating rules, ideally some sort of customer API, and then that data then is accessible for omni-channel engagement, targeted advertising, and potentially localized analytics. This was the original vision for a CDP. This was a vision that was encapsulated by a lot of early vendors, by the Customer Data Platform Institute and others. It turns out that this is probably a little bit more monolithic than most enterprises would want. And in fact, if you already have a customer data infrastructure, this is maybe overkill with respect to the kinds of capabilities that you need. And so from the very beginning, there were different architectures involved that were what we would describe as potentially more decoupled, even more composable from the very beginning. But this is the initial sort of concept for it. Now, if we look at what's going on in the marketplace now, we're seeing a lot of industry maturation. So first of all, composable stacks have won the game, and so we're seeing a great MarTech decoupling with these sort of legless services. A variety of use cases for CDPs. We identify 10 of them when we evaluate CDP vendors. A lot of focus on data processing versus data activation. Some vendors focus more on processing, some more on activation. This is a really key architectural consideration for you. And the big players have joined this market. So the suite vendors, after initially saying you didn't need a CDP, now Adobe, Salesforce, Oracle, Microsoft are all saying you do need a CDP, and moreover, you need our CDP. We would argue that that's a kind of coupling in your stack that you would want to avoid, but let's talk about that a little bit later. So now we get to really the headless and more importantly legless architecture for the 2020s, where you have these enterprise foundation services at the bottom that are decoupled from engagement services. You see content and information on the left, decisioning services on the right, and then in the middle here, these data services. So notice you don't see the word CDP there, because what a CDP can do will vary depending on the scope of what you want it to do and what the vendor thinks that you need. So we break this down into customer data activation, customer data operations, and enterprise data intelligence. Now, one thing I can say is that typically you don't want to be looking for enterprise data intelligence out of your CDP. And this is usually because a CDP doesn't represent a superset of all of your different customer data records and fields. And so typically you want to have data intelligence working off more of sort of a data lake type environment. But certainly the question of whether your CDP should do more than just activation and also cover customer data operations, that's a viable question and something of a debate going on in the market right now. And then of course, AI rides on top of all this, in particular insights and decisioning AI when it comes to CDPs. So this is the emerging large enterprise model where you separate customer data processing in more of a process hub. So this is blue on the left, and this is really a data ops function. And to the extent it's a data ops function, they probably are going to want to, and it probably makes sense for them to use their own platforms and systems to do this. So their own tooling, specifically their own lakehouses, but also all of the tooling that they might have around a data lakehouse, including ingest, transform, clean, process, unify, enrich, comply, graph, apply rules, all these sorts of things that really have to do with heavy duty data processing, versus customer data activation, which is really more of a marketing operations capability. And it turns out these are different capabilities that require different interfaces driven towards different personas within your enterprise. So it's important to understand what you're looking for within a CDP, because some CDPs will do both of these, some will just do the activation piece. And so it's really critical at an architectural level to understand first and foremost, what's the scope of the CDP that you're trying to deliver here? And I would say that maybe more than half of the CDP failures that we see stem from this very problem, that there was an architectural mismatch between the CDP and that the enterprise bought and what it was that they actually needed. And this has been interesting, because I would say that as much as maybe a third of the CDP selections that RSG is involved with are actual replacements. So organizations that made a bad decision initially and need to replace their CDP. So where are we going? I think there's definitely some composable decoupling that's going on, in particular decoupling from the lakehouse. It turns out a lakehouse is a great place to store the superset of all of your data, to be the system of record. It's not always a great place to activate data from. We've seen a lot of disappointment with enterprises using reverse ETL as their CDP, but basically decoupling from your lakehouse is a strong idea. We're seeing more CDPs used for decisioning and orchestration. It turns out that decisioning seems to want to be close to data. And there's been a lot of disappointment with the sort of pure play heavyweight journey and decisioning platforms. And so doing it in a lightweight way in your CDP seems to be a really kind of helpful starter pack for many of the enterprises we work with. So again, composability is really more of an evolution than a revolution. You kind of want to understand, in particular, you probably want to decompose customer data processing versus customer data activation, because again, these are two different functions, probably served by two different organizations within your enterprise. But then depending on how much you want to decompose it, even within that, you do need to be careful, particularly on the right side, or the purple boxes here, that you're not applying a kind of data ops problem for a set of marketing ops people, which is another way of saying that when we see people try to build super composable platforms for marketing ops folks, sometimes the usability isn't always there, and they would have been better off just with a more traditional CDP. We can talk about that more if you have questions going forward. But anyway, what we really see here is customer data operations sort of being at the core. Again, this is a this is a data ops function over on the left here. Then you have activation, which is a marketing ops function, and then insights and data intelligence, which is more of a marketing analytics or data analytics, enterprise data analytics function. So these three have to work together. The core typically is customer data ops, and then it's driving more towards activation and intelligence. The problem that we have is that many of us are facing a legacy where our customer data has really been built for data intelligence and not for activation means. And so when you try to build an activation platform off of a data analytics foundation, sometimes it doesn't turn out so well. And that's another reason why we see reverse ETL vendors sometimes not really performing particularly well when they're trying to play that sort of a role. But let's talk about selecting CDPs. So we're talking about architectural, the importance of making sure you understand where you sit architecturally, what some of the trends are. Now let's talk about the marketplace as a whole. It's a very large marketplace, highly fragmented, as I mentioned. We tend to bifurcate it into quadrants and 5 boxes here. We're not making any kind of winning quadrants here, loser quadrants. This is just a view of the market. Of course, any two-dimensional view is going to be a little bit overgeneralized, right? You put vendors into boxes, and really it can be more of a continuum. But generally speaking, you can divide north and south between suite vendors and independents, and then between left and right, those that are more processing oriented platforms, data processing oriented, versus those that are more data leverage oriented. And again, we're not making a judgment about which one that you may need. That's really up to you. Where we would make a judgment is, in general, we find enterprises much less happy with the suite vendor CDPs. And typically that's because they didn't actually buy them, they inherited them. In other words, someone else made the decision, hey, we're going with Salesforce. And so that's taken Salesforce off the hook for actually competing and putting a really usable product out there. But also there's a very good chance that it's a mismatch for you. So we're seeing a lot of disappointment with the suite vendors. On the independent side, again, you have a lot of different choices here. We've got High Touch and RudderStack as reverse ETL vendors. Again, a lot of disappointment there as well. I would also highlight Dun & Bradstreet over here on the decisioning-oriented Dun & Bradstreet, Syncari, LeadSpace, Terminus. Those are the B2B ones. Also a lot of disappointment there. So I'm not suggesting that you don't look at them. I'm just suggesting that the experience of your peers has been suboptimal, and so you want to be very, very careful and test very carefully before you sign on a dotted line. We'll talk in a minute about how to do that. But in the meantime, this is a pretty good breakdown of where the different vendors lie, at least this year. But the key thing to evaluating vendors, and we do this on our own evaluations across the board, regardless of vendor category, is to use business use cases. So when we look at CDP vendors, we evaluate them against 10 canonical CDP business use cases. Now, the reality is that I can guarantee you there's none of you that are going to light up all 10. And what I would encourage you to do is to say, okay, which 2 or 3 of these are super important for us? They're going to drive maximum business value, and really focus on those. Because vendors that try to do a lot of these often fail to do any of them very, very well. So over on the left with advanced customer data management, offline and omni-channel aggregation, those are more some of the heavy duty data operations capabilities, which you may not need in a CDP. Likewise, in the next column, predictive analytics and real-time behavioral analysis, those are analytics and intelligence capabilities that you may not need in a CDP. And in fact, typically in a CDP, these aren't going to necessarily be very good either. So again, capabilities you may or may not want to consider. All of the other 6 have to do with actual engagement. And different CDPs are going to address these in different ways. And so you want to understand not just does the CDP do it, but how effectively and how does it actually approach this particular use case. Household and B2B channel support are a really interesting one. Most CDP vendors coming out of the B2C world aren't very good at this. So if that's really important to you from day one, that's going to be something you're going to want to test very, very carefully. And you can certainly look at our research to get kind of a deeper insight into that. But I use that word test. And what I want to encourage you with any MarTech or data platform is to always test before you buy. My colleague Jared and I wrote an entire book about this, published by Rosenfeld Media, The Right Way to Select Technology. This is a more agile design thinking approach. It's business focused, team-based, empirical, iterative, and adaptive. So we actually put together a lot of these concepts before the era of CDP, but one thing that's been really, I would say almost kind of heartening, is how well this model actually works for CDPs, where many enterprises have literally bought them without ever testing them. And it turns out that you can use this methodology and you can absolutely test CDP before you buy it. And it was so interesting. I was at a conference the other week, and I was at a table with a couple of marketing leaders from large enterprises, and they were like, oh, no one would ever support us testing something before we bought it. It was like, it blew my mind, but it shouldn't have blown my mind, because this happens quite often. You know, you would never go out and buy a car just based on the salesperson driving it around the parking lot, yet people will go out, large organizations will go out and buy enterprise marketing technology without ever trying it themselves, and without ever test driving more than one. So we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So you definitely want to drive the car before you buy it. And even if it's a complicated car like a CDP, that's all the more reason why you want to test before you buy. So the way you go about this in design thinking uses the rubric that I'm sure you're all familiar with now from design thinking, which is empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And so the way that this works is basically using it in the context of selecting technology as a filtration process. So first you create diverse user stories, and you're looking at maybe 30 plus vendors. What those user stories are going to tell you is what's really important to you, and then just based on vendor architecture and proclivities, that maybe knocks you down to a list of 6 to 8 vendors. Those are the vendors you want to send an RFP to. That RFP should not be a bunch of checklist questions, but rather those same user stories. So the user stories are very much customer stories around how you want them to be able to interact in this new world where you have access to all this wonderful actionable customer data, but also marketer and data ops stories as well. So that should be the center of your RFP. Then you review proposals and demos against that. What you definitely always want to do is have a hands-on bake-off. CDP bake-offs that we help enterprises conduct are anywhere from 3 to 5 days long, so they're not complicated, but you do get hands-on, and I can tell you that will show you in black and white what the CDP wants to do and what it will do grudgingly and what it will not do at all. You will not get that from a salesperson demo. You will get that kind of high contrast relief in an actual hands-on bake-off. It can be done. It requires a little bit of organization, requires a little bit of effort. The payoff is enormous because not only does it help you select the right vendor from the 2 finalists and reduce a lot of risk, but it also helps you understand what it's going to take to be successful with that platform. And so we find that enterprises that go through this sort of a bake-off process typically get to an MVP faster, and they have a much more successful MVP as a result. So it's not just around making the right choice, but really setting you up for success regardless of the choice that you make. Then you do want to test a single finalist. That's when you can do a lot of integration testing, pen testing, whatever sorts of test, other technical heavy duty testing you want to do, probably performance testing. It's always important in a CDP. You do that while you're negotiating the contract. We find that CDP contracts can be extremely complicated. They can take anywhere from 2 to 6 months, more typically 3 to 4 months to negotiate. A lot of people don't bake that into their schedule. So what we suggest you do during that 3 to 4 months that you're negotiating that contract is you do some additional testing in your sandbox, so that when the time comes that the contract is signed, you're ready to go. You're ready to start rolling out that MVP, and you've removed all of the technical and integration risk out of the equation at that point. Okay, so let's wrap up here with some key takeaways. CDPs are continuing to evolve. The customers that make best use of them typically have their customer data house in order, which means you really need to understand where your customer data is, how you're going to leverage it, which attributes you really need as opposed to which attributes you think you need. What's the difference between a data lake that has all of your raw customer data and the actual marketing attributes that you're going to leverage, and what are the use cases that then drive the latter, right? So it's really about getting clear here, but then also being clear about your architecture. What do you want to get out of a CDP and what do you not want to get out of a CDP? The canonical business narratives are unlikely to change much. So, the 10 that we use to evaluate CDP vendors, those 10 are likely to stand up for the good part of the rest of the decade. So use those to get clear about what's most important for your enterprise. Vendors are beginning to sort themselves out into different categories, certainly activation versus processing, outbound marketing versus decisioning, the extent to which how they integrate with your internal data lakes. These are different things where vendors are sorting themselves out. There's MarTech vendors that have extreme lock-in risks. So we're beginning to see more and more boxes. Originally we had 2 boxes, then we had 3, then we had 4, now we have 5, maybe next year we'll have 6 boxes. So this is actually good, this kind of vendor sort that's happening. but really getting clear about what you need will help you narrow things down. And then always, always, always employ an agile-oriented selection process that features adaptive testing. The CDP marketplace is going to be fragmented for some time. You're going to have a hell of a lot of choices. That's good. It may even be bringing some price pressures to bear, hopefully so. So definitely use architecture as a filter, but again, prioritize your business scenarios as your prime criteria. Now, one thing, you know, composable or not, you are still going to need developers and data analysts. We've never seen a CDP where an enterprise wasn't building their own connectors. You just do, you're going to. The CDP vendors talk about how they have these fabulous connectors. You're going to probably not be using them at all. You're going to be building a lot. So that's all to say, not only are you going to need data ops people and data analysts and data engineers, you're also going to need actual developers as well. So even in a less composable environment, you need to be ready to do some heavy duty technical lifting. Certainly, our research and advisory can help you make the right decisions, whether you need a CDP at all, what kind of architecture you need, going through a test-based selection process. These are all things that we do for large enterprises to really help you make the right decisions. That's our goal in life. That's why we founded the company. That's why I'm sitting here talking to you today. So there's a variety of ways we can do that. One is to help you find the best fit vendor. You can get access to our CDP research and use our self-service tools to access that research, generate a real quadrant that works for you, get the pros, and most importantly, get the serious cons about each vendor. So you know, being forewarned is forearmed. Some of our larger subscribers just select all of these streams from us and get all of our research, what we call a full stack subscription. And we advise them not just on individual product decisions, but also just how to optimize their overall stack. And then a subset of those companies then join our exclusive MarTech Leadership Council, where we meet several times a year, once or twice in person, and then several times virtually. No vendors, no salespeople, just MarTech leaders like you get together, share stories, talk about what's working, talk about what's not working, work together to try to make each other more effective. So if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to us. Speaking of which, this is how you can reach out to us. That's my colleague Scott. If you approach us through any of these means, you will hear back from him. He's a really nice guy. He wants you to be successful. So feel free to reach out at any time. In the meantime, we've got a couple of minutes. If any of you had any questions, feel free to use the questions tab in the Go to Webinar Control Panel. So already I see a couple of them come in. The first one is about Microsoft. You hadn't mentioned much about Microsoft except as a suite vendor. What's their story? So their story is, like a lot of suite vendors, they basically are just trying to backstop their own platforms with their own CDP, and it's basically more of a defensive move that they don't want you to license somebody else's. So this came out of, you know, the marketing and CRM, this sort of mid-market marketing and CRM story that they have, and they just kind of plopped a database behind it and called it a CDP, and that allows you to more easily have a single store of data that you can then apply some Azure tools against. So it's not the worst thing in the world if you've got an all Microsoft engagement environment. Most organizations don't. You're more likely than not going to need more of an independent CDP layer in your architecture. The second question from Jelaine, can you talk more about customer data operations versus customer data leverage? Yeah, they sound similar at one sense, but they're really two kind of different ends of the spectrum. Customer data operations, or we sometimes call this customer data management, Jelaine, is around actually getting the data ready to activate. So it's ingesting it, cleaning it, applying rules against it, validating it, turning raw data into actionable attributes, labeling those attributes, providing compliance and other controls against it. Big one is identity resolution. So everything you need to get high quality, verifiable, reliable data to a marketing person who with fields and structures that they understand and know to be of high quality. And so all that leads up to that typically is a data ops function. And there's a variety of different data ops tools that the enterprise might need. But then data leverage is, what does the marketer do with all of that? And so there could be a variety of different analytics workflows, as we mentioned, typically outside of a CDP. But then within a CDP, you're typically going to be activating that data either in a manual way or by having all kinds of automated routines running and different rules and orchestration and so forth to actually do something with that data, make some valuable use out of it, or have other systems access that data, ideally in real time, to do interesting things with it. So that's what we mean by data leverage. And that's typically managed by a marketing ops team. Again, a CDP vendor may give you both interfaces and both capabilities. Some may just do one or the other. It's an important architectural distinction to make. So with that, we're wrapping up here. Always good to spend some time with you. Feel free to reach out at any time, download a sample. You can join our mailing list to find out about future webinars. We'll be talking more about journey orchestration, AI, digital asset management, all sorts of other interesting topics as the year comes to a close here. But always great to spend some time with you, and look forward to staying in touch. So for the rest of the Real Story Group, this is Tony Byrne signing out for now. Bye now.